Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, How to Shift from In-Person to Agile Qualitative Research. We're so glad you could join us today. I'm Audrey, and I'll be your MC for this presentation. At the end of the webinar, we'll have time for a Q&A, so if at any time during the presentation you have questions you'd like to ask, please submit them in the questions box and we'll save them for the end. Now, I'd like to introduce you to our host, Digsite. Digsite is the leading solution for agile qualitative research that has enabled brands and agencies to create online communities quickly and easily. With Digsite sprints, companies can recruit, engage, and iterate with their target consumers in as little as 24 hours. And Digsite Smart Reporting creates beautiful, automated, and customizable reports that are fast and easy to generate. With Digsite, participants can complete tasks you assign them on their own time, giving you the opportunity to follow up and iterate with them as you learn. Now, let me introduce you to our speaker. Monica is the CEO and co-founder of Digsite. She has more than 20 years of marketing, innovation, and market research experience. Monica has held positions at General Mills, Pillsbury, and the AC Nielsen Center for Marketing Research at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's a frequent speaker and regular blogger on research topics. Now, here's Monica.
Thank you, Audrey. Really glad to have all of you on the line today. So in today's webinar, I have three kind of topic areas I'm going to cover. First, I'm just going to talk a little bit about Agile and what Agile means for qualitative research. I know it's a buzzword thrown around a lot, so we're going to get a little bit more in depth on that. And then we're going to dig into kind of tips on how to implement Agile Qualitative and what that might look like. And finally, drilling into some specific examples of projects and how they might be executed in person versus using more Agile approaches. So to start, let's just talk a little bit about Agile principles. Companies today are adopting Agile principles to kind of speed up innovation in their organizations. And as probably all of you know, the impact of this kind of Agile movement is being felt organization-wide, from innovation through marketing. But Agile isn't a process or a tool. It's a set of principles. And these set of principles are great for us in market research because they put consumers at the center of organizational change. So what I have here on the slide is just an example of how organizations are applying Agile principles within marketing teams or research teams. And when you look at this list here, you'll see that a couple of big themes emerge when really applying Agile principles. First is the focus on consumer empathy and understanding as a grounding point for teams to make decisions. And the second is the notion that smaller, more flexible, and collaborative planning and development tends to work faster. And so in other words, Agile isn't a principle of being fast. Agile is a set of principles that ultimately lead to being fast. And the concept of deeper consumer understanding, collaboration, and iteration really supports the movement we're seeing towards more qualitative research. It suggests that teams should be focusing more on unstructured discussion versus rigid surveys, focusing more on kind of discovery and understanding versus just quantification and kind of yes/no type research, and also towards the idea of experimentation versus large-scale research projects. So really setting up those small experiments, whether those be in-market experiments or whether those be experiments done within a qualitative research environment. And then the idea of collaborative learning versus static reporting, which is also really well enabled through qualitative approaches. The other important thing to understand about Agile is the concept of sprints. And really that's one of the core approaches of Agile is kind of the concept of sprints. And sprints change the flow of research away from maybe what I thought of as the best practice earlier in my career of doing a big qualitative study at the beginning of a project or development, and then a survey at the end or a series of surveys. Instead, sprints suggest that we really break our development cycle down into much shorter sprint cycles, typically kind of in a 2 to 4 week time frame. So let's just say that you are planning, you're a food company, and you're planning to change an ingredient in your cookies to capitalize on a potential health claim. Rather than doing one big study on health and maybe diving into that specific ingredient, you might do a smaller study where you not only kind of understood people's context around health and that ingredient, but you actually developed and got feedback on 3 possible either line extensions or product claims. Based on your feedback, that team changes directions and realize that they maybe need to make some other changes in the product in order to really make some kind of health claim credible. And so they run another sprint cycle and they test more ideas. Certainly these are outcomes of things that we've all done in research, but they're not always the way that we've planned it. We might plan to succeed the first time instead of planning to kind of break our problem down into smaller pieces and knowing that the process of iteration will work. And so this notion of really developing, learning, and prototyping kind of simultaneously is really helping teams move through development processes faster and build solutions more iteratively. It also prevents a ton of rework from the assumptions that you might make between your one study and your next study as you're kind of learning and building solutions. So unfortunately, in-person qualitative often just doesn't fit within the 2 to 4 week sprint cycle. It's not to say that it can't be done, and sometimes it isn't absolutely appropriate or the right method, but time and budget alone can make in-person research tenuous, and then you layer on the fact that in-person research really isn't designed to easily allow you to go back to participants to iterate. It tends to not always be the best fit. So this is where really online tools that are specifically designed for Agile Qualitative can help. So for an example, an online sprint can cut your budget and your timeline roughly in half. And that enables you to do more sprints within your development process. So this really isn't about doing less research, it's about doing more research. It's just having that research be much more targeted and focused and implemented in a way that allows you to be able to do more research within the same budget. And while Agile Qualitative is not a survey with statistical significance attached, it does provide cumulative validation so that each subsequent test can kind of incorporate and build on the learning of the prior research. So you go from ideas that are good but have some holes in them to refined ideas, and you further refine and apply your learning, and through that process you have some flexibility. And so oftentimes with in-person research it's hard to do more than a few groups, but with kind of Agile qualitative approaches you can typically flex your sample sizes quite a bit. In fact, here at Digsite we've seen qual studies run with as many as 200 participants. So how do you make the switch to Agile Qualitative? I'm going to start with just some tips that might help you kind of get started. First off, finding the right participants is really, really critical to Agile development. This is kind of because you're building empathy and understanding. You really need to have both kind of experiences and contexts that your participants can share with you. And you probably need the frame of reference of their experiences to guide their reactions to your ideas. In other words, you need the 20% of people who will drive 80% of your volume. And that historically is, can be achieved affordably through qualitative and not so affordably through quantitative research. However, as we all know, qualitative recruiting, whether it's online or in person, has tended to be, a two-plus week process. And so how do you do it fast? How do you do it faster? There are 3 kind of approaches that we've seen be effective for kind of rapid but yet highly targeted recruiting. The first is kind of behavior-based targeting. So here at Digsite, we use an approach called Social Find. Basically, we're able to micro-target people based on their attitudes, interests, and behaviors on social media that are indicators for us if they like certain brands, if they're engaged in certain activities, if they talk about certain things. And that allows us to oftentimes complete recruiting in a couple of days versus a couple of weeks. If that, in addition to that, you can also look at what we'll call pre-screened panels. So, for example, sometimes there's information that just isn't easily findable on social media, believe it or not. It's kind of hard to believe, but there is. And so oftentimes what we'll do is we have a kind of a panel of past qualitative participants, and it's kind of a qual-only panel because we don't find the same engagement rates with quantitative panels. But we're able to then kind of more in-depth profile those folks on a regular basis. So many of our subscribers will go in and run typing tools past these panelists and so forth, so that they have kind of pre-screened, pre-identified participants for their upcoming projects. And that enables them to then essentially get participants often overnight. And then the third option is really Agile communities themselves. And so if you want to bring a group into a community, and then you can really have the opportunity to engage with them over a period of days or weeks, so that you can learn and iterate with that same audience over that time frame. So that allows you to get farther with that group of people before maybe you want to go to a fresh sample. And some people obviously use ongoing communities for Agile research as well. There can be some challenges of, kind of reusing the same participants over time, but there are some great applications for ongoing communities for Agile as well. In terms of the research itself, you want to make sure that you're designing methods that help you with in three kind of key areas. So empathy, iteration, and experience. While I know you probably don't typically associate empathy with online research, I really think social media has been a game changer in showing us how we can build empathy online. There's actually some really strong evidence that people are more honest in online environments. So I'll share a little bit of that later. And I'm sure I'm not alone here in using in-person qualitative to iterate. It certainly can be done. I've brought that illustrator along to the back room to make changes between focus groups. But online environments can make this much more seamless, particularly because we can engage with people asynchronously. In other words, we can engage with them over a period of time rather than having everybody in the room at 2 p.m. And capturing experiences used to be done through photos and video diaries, and brought to a focus group or viewed when we visited someone at home, can often be captured and shared online. And in fact, many companies are now building kind of mini experiments into online qualitative, kind of combining lean and agile principles to say, hey, go do this and let's see what your behavior is. The third thing is to really think about having that Agile toolkit within your organization as a capability, rather than thinking about it as a project that you go out and buy. And I want to kind of give you a sense of what some of those options are. So some of the research I've read suggests that about half of you are using some form of online qualitative. In talking with folks that have made the switch from, say, in-person to video interviews or chat-based interviews, it sounds like it typically can solve issues related to location or sample availability, but it doesn't tend to speed up the process. In other words, it's still pretty difficult to get everybody in the same room at the same time. The more agile form of online qualitative tends to be, again, these more asynchronous tools. And the reason is you just have more flexibility. So for example, you can use a tool like video sharing, where a participant records a video of themselves or maybe records a screen capture in combination with text-based conversations to kind of build empathy and to capture experiences. And you can use tools like image markup or ranking or rating questions, or even one-on-one messaging with participants to iterate and collaborate as you build ideas. So the other interesting thing about asynchronous tools is they tend to, some of them are strictly unmoderated and some are strictly moderated and some are kind of a combination. But if you try to use both unmoderated and moderated tools together, you can often achieve results that might even exceed what you've gotten from in-person research. So again, I think it's natural for us as researchers to assume that in-person research would always be better, but there are actually a number of factors in unmoderated research that can improve our empathy and understanding. So what I have here, the three bullets that aren't kind of highlighted are basically insights from a Pew Research study that did a large-scale test looking at open-ended questions asked in an unmoderated online survey versus a moderated phone interview. And they saw some cases where the results were similar and some cases where the results were very different. And here's kind of what they saw as the strength of each that can really help you understand how to get the most accuracy from participants in your research. So unmoderated activities tends to avoid overstatement, particularly of socially desirable behaviors and attitudes. So if you're talking about a topic that you think has a potentially right answer, or maybe they might think and think what you as the moderator might want them to say, you're going to get less of that kind of bias when you do an unmoderated activity, when you ask them in an online forum and they have a chance to kind of reply in their own time in their own space. Also, unmoderated activities avoids kind of understatement of opinions and behaviors that participants fear would elicit disapproval from another person. So there's a lot of bias that can happen there when you're in the room and you ask a question when they think that you might disapprove of their response. And this is particularly about disliking things, right? People don't want to dislike concepts that you share with them in an in-person environment. And I will never forget from my food days the death of a concept being, oh, I'd use that camping, right? I mean, we know people just kind of come up with these compensatory things to say to help you feel better as the moderator, to be honest. And then the other thing that unmoderated does is remove that implicit time pressure that can affect a respondent's ability to recall facts or past events. So I see this a lot where participants will come back in an online forum and go, oh, you know what, I forgot to mention blah, 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 right? So sometimes in the moment, they're not thinking of that specific example or that brand or whatever. And this kind of gives them more time to do that. One of the things that this research didn't mention, but I think is another thing that I've seen with unmoderated activities is that ability to do timed activities that can kind of get you towards that system one thinking. So if you want to say in 5 seconds, tell me X, you could actually have a group of people do that and kind of accumulate those findings even on a qualitative basis. Now, moderated activities, on the other hand, help with some very specific and important aspects of qualitative research. One is that they can help participants stay focused and encourage participation, right? And so we see that often within Digsite with discussion tasks and things where you're able to respond and then go back to the group and ask follow-ups, or even go back to that individual and ask follow-ups. You can kind of help direct the group or direct the individual back on task. You can actually provide clarification for requests for participation from participants. Now we know that, we're trying to use more AI, artificial intelligence, to do some of that with unmoderated activities, but at this point, I think most of the really kind of rich kinds of clarification still probably happens through moderated activities. And then obviously you're able to ask follow-up questions to drill deeper in responses, and that kind of helps get maybe to another level of understanding. I think one interesting thing about online qualitative versus in-person moderated activities is, and sometimes, I remember this in the focus group, right, where you ask somebody to write the number down on their piece of paper before sharing that with the group. With moderated online qualitative, you have that opportunity to do that for every discussion. Everybody gets to be the first response. So you can have everybody in the group answer the question, and then kind of magically they see everybody else's responses instantly, and then they're able to engage from there. And so that kind of helps also kind of minimize bias. So there's a lot of things that really can indicate here that kind of doing a combination of moderated and unmoderated activities in the Agile qualitative setting might actually get you to better empathy, richer understanding, and more accurate kind of responses. So the last part of this session, what I'd like to do is kind of drill in more specifically to some concrete examples of how in-person study might be transitioned to Agile Qualitative with a mix of moderated and unmoderated activities. So I'm going to kind of take you to a hypothetical example here of, and I've kind of built this into 3 topic areas. So one on building empathy, one on experiences, and the other on iteration. So let's just we'll talk empathy first here. So bathroom remodeling. Let's say you want to first kind of just build empathy and understand kind of what someone's going through when they remodel a bathroom. And in a focus group, you might have a flow that looks something like, telling me about what prompted you to remodel your bathroom, right? So you can kind of get into what's going on with them and their worlds. Where did you go for ideas and inspiration? Maybe that's another discussion topic. And then, maybe use a projective exercise. If remodeling was like an amusement park ride, what ride would it be? So that would be maybe a typical way you might approach this topic in a focus group. If you were doing this in an in-home kind of ethnographic setting, you might actually want someone to show you the bathroom that's either under remodeling or been remodeled. You might ask those same questions about where you went for ideas or inspiration. You might even get on a computer with them and have them show you some of the sites that you toured out. And then you probably would actually get more in depth specifically with them about maybe some of their process in remodeling and kind of try to drill into how they felt at those various stages, or kind of what happened. So with Agile Qualitative, you get a little bit of both. For example, you can certainly ask a conversation question of the group to say, hey, what prompted you to remodel your bathroom? And you can have participants see each other's responses and kind of learn from that basic experience. You can also say, hey, I want you to post pictures of products or websites that you looked at for inspiration. And you can even ask them maybe to take a short video of their bathroom, show them the goods and bads of the process wherever they're at in that remodeling process. So you can see here, you can kind of capture a lot of the same kinds of information, just in a slightly different way. So I want to show you kind of what some of these things might look like in an online environment. So this is just, these are not from that exact topic area, but if you want to ask someone to kind of tell a little bit about themselves, it's just an example of an online post with a photo. Here's another example where the whiteboarding tool was used to kind of journey map. So you kind of looked at, here are the different stages that maybe you went through in your process of remodeling, and then tell me about what you did in each of those steps, which is kind of the gray circles, and then tell me kind of the highs and lows of that experience, and the person can kind of map that journey out for you. So this gives you an idea of how you might get just way, way richer information than you could ever get in a focus group, maybe more akin to what you might get in an online or an in-depth interview, but from a larger group of people. So let's go to another kind of example, that idea that you want to iterate with participants in your Agile Qualitative. So in a focus group setting, what you might, in this case, I'm kind of drilling now from just general remodeling to, let's say you're some type of solution for bathroom storage. You're looking for bathroom storage solutions or products. So you might, in a focus group, might want to ask specifically, well, what are your biggest needs for counter space or storage? Maybe you have a card sort. Maybe you have them brainstorm, or you bring in a bunch of things and you want them to see, what are the most important needs identified by the group, kind of group them together, and maybe have them kind of discuss those and, kind of rank them. Maybe you even kind of then decide that between one focus group and the next focus group, you're actually going to make some revisions to what those cards are, or maybe show them some specific concepts and then iterate on those concepts across groups. And then kind of at the end, kind of talk to them about the concepts you showed them, what they liked best and why. So that's kind of focus group. So the Agile Qualitative version of that would be in some ways similar. You might ask them a conversation again about what their needs are, kind of similar question. Again, you could have them respond with text, you could respond with videos, whatever would make sense for that activity. And then the next thing might be vote on the top needs identified by the group. So you could actually, if you were to do this in, say, a conversation task, you could go in and just highlight the responses that you think are most representative, push those into another activity, and have people crowd vote on them. So then now they can actually vote on what they think are the most important needs as a group. You can do that same process of showing concepts, and you can even randomize them within a qualitative, online qualitative environment, which is tough to do in focus groups, but doable, kind of, sort of. And then you can iterate on those. So you can decide you might want to do that once, twice, 3 times over whatever period of time. And then you can even have participants build their ideal solution. So I have some examples here of that. So here's just an example of a voting activity where folks were able to, again, kind of, they responded in an open-ended manner, and then we kind of picked those responses and pushed them into a voting task where people were to say whether they agreed or disagreed with those statements. This is kind of an interesting one where you'll see that picture in the background and that text was actually participant generated. So the participant participants came in and generated a bunch of ideas for their kind of holiday shopping app that they would like. And what we were able to do is, 25 people submitted their ideas, and we took the top 5 and we actually put them back into the community as a whiteboard. And then participants were able to kind of go in and build on those ideas and talk about what they liked and disliked about them. So it was really kind of consumer-generated ideas that were kind of iterated and built on. This is an example where it might be an idea that you've generated and you kind of put out there. Then you're able to kind of have them respond to likes and dislikes on that, as well as rate that idea, and again, put in a whole bunch of open-ended commentary. So you'll see one of the green dots there at the bottom, and follow up and have a conversation about it. The final bucket we're going to talk about is kind of experience. So imagine you wanted to kind of understand remodeling both from an in-store experience and an in-home experience perspective. What you might do is some kind of ethnographic research. Maybe you do an in-market observation where you meet at a big box store and you have them go through the shopping process with you. Now, it's going to be hard to catch people when they are, right in the middle of remodeling, like people who remodeled in the past and are kind of re-going through that activity with you, but that's kind of the process you'd go through. Maybe you also meet them at home at some point during that remodel project. And then you could also ask them to maybe just record those things and then bring a photo or video diary to a focus group. So those would be kind of some options on how you might approach that in a more kind of in-person perspective. In an Agile Qualitative approach, what you might ask them to do is record a video or post photos of their shopping activities. Though some of those may be online, some of those may be in store. You could have them create kind of fill in the blank, I'll show you that in a minute, task that allows you to kind of in a guided way, record specific elements of their remodel. And then you could also have them upload photos and videos to discuss and respond in the group forum. So in other words, you could actually have people see each other's shopping experience and respond to each other's thoughts about shopping or at home, which you obviously don't typically get when you do ethnographic research. You only get kind of that participant's point of view. And what's really interesting about that process of kind of allowing the participants to see each other's responses is kind of the magic that can happen when somebody sees what somebody else did, right? They go, oh my gosh, that's a great idea, or I'd never thought of that. That might even spark some ideas. So this is just an example of a fill in the blank activity where basically you can kind of guide people through a story, right? So you can kind of tell them, hey, the first thing I did this, or when I went here to the pasta aisle, the worst part was this, and here's why, for example, and I wish blah, blah, blah. So kind of help, and you could kind of have a choice of open-ended or closed-ended responses within that fill in the blank. So it gives you some structure and it's unmoderated, but at the same time, it kind of gives you that almost prompted way of probing automatically by structuring the question. The other thing that we see often for experience research is really the opportunity to test solutions. So you can certainly go in and look at how people are using existing products, and we've seen studies where people will send people existing products to go try in home, or recruit people who have those products in homes. We've seen both of those, and then we've also seen people go in with obviously prototypes. And one of the interesting things about doing this in an agile way with Agile Qualitative, where you might be able to iterate with them, is you can have them use different features on different days. And so in addition to kind of sharing with you what they did, you can ask them questions and have them do things, right? You can kind of get both pieces of information. So, just to kind of summarize things up, I would say at this point, if you have questions, please throw them in the question box, but I'm going to kind of summarize here really what does effective Agile Qualitative look like? And I would say kind of 3 big do's are: 1, just plan more small-scale qualitative initiatives throughout the development process. It doesn't mean that you never do quantitative research, doesn't mean you never do in-person research. It's just really looking at how you can kind of build more small-scale qualitative in your development process, leveraging online tools for both speed and for quality. And then really important to involve your team in learning from and experimenting with consumers. So really the more you can kind of look at the research as the guiding light for the decisions will really help with a lot of those agile principles that you saw at the very beginning. And on the don't side, don't expect your team to stop building solutions while you conduct research. It's just not, it's not okay in an organization anymore to wait for research. And so therefore you have to be maybe more planful at the beginning, but maybe you just need more flexible and faster solutions so that you don't have to try to anticipate when, as we all know, you anticipate something and then 2 weeks later it changes and you've wasted all that time and effort. Don't rely on in-person research to meet all of your needs. There's a ton of great technology out there that can help you and go after it, and really think about it as building a capability for your organization rather than thinking about it as, you know, a single project. And then finally, don't wait until after the research is completed to provide your first report. This is one thing I think that can be applied across everything you do. Think about, you know, when we do Agile Qualitative, people report on a daily basis for a 4-day community, and there's discussion and there's an opportunity to iterate and ask follow-up questions or even change direction as you learn. And so really thinking about how you involve that team in learning as you go will help you with that set of questions at the end that might derail your direction. So you really want to kind of continue to really think about that kind of collaborative nature of what you're doing. It doesn't mean that everyone on your team needs to be a researcher. It just means that they need to be involved in learning and understanding and building and iterating. So with that, I will open it up for questions.
Okay, we got a couple questions coming in, but just again, if you have any others, please submit them now. First question is, are there other online tools outside of bulletin boards / blogs that you feel are valuable?
There are a lot of online tools out there that I would recommend that you look at. There are tools for video capture. There are tools for what do you call it? You know, live video interviews. There's tools for usability testing. There are a variety of options out there. You know, what we're trying to accomplish here at Digsite is to kind of put all of those in one place for you so that you don't have to go out and buy a whole bunch of different tools. But there really is kind of, I think, almost an overwhelming amount of different technology out there to wade through. And Forrester actually just published a report that had kind of some good information. So if you have access to Forrester, I can certainly refer you to that article. They just put it out maybe in the last week or two.
Great. Another question is, do you provide report deliverables for each sprint or one final deliverable after the whole iterations?
Yeah, so interestingly, when we look at conducting sprints here at Digsite, what we recommend as a best practice is kind of a process of the moderator kind of pinning some things as they're watching the community unfold. We also have some automation that automatically pins some of the most relevant content, does some sentiment analysis on it, and kind of captures the keywords. And then you can kind of auto-generate a smart report each day, and then you can kind of do a more kind of fleshed out top line at the end. But it gives the team some initial findings to kind of discuss. If they don't have time to go into that community and look, they at least can kind of look at that smart report even on a daily basis.
Great. Another question is, are there any specific industries / stakeholder groups where you find these agile techniques to be more applicable and or receptive by the participants? Are these more applicable to B2C or B2B?
That's a great question. We have seen this work in specific kinds of B2B environments. We've seen it work for, you know, basically all kinds of professionals. If you're dealing with professionals, I think this kind of approach works extremely well. For B2B projects where your customers may be in the field, may not be on a computer, or maybe the type of person who is doing more kind of manual kind of labor, it might be a little bit more challenging to find that audience, we find them, and we've done some of that work. B2C clearly is where we see the bulk of spending, but that doesn't mean that that is not as applicable to B2B. In terms of like types of consumers and target groups where Agile Qualitative works really well, I think when you're talking about, for example, busy moms or millennials or teens, they are extremely receptive to this approach, and I think are often hard to find for in-person research. But I think there really aren't a lot of audiences that are challenging. I'm trying to think, maybe some challenges with groups like farmers might be a tough one for some audiences, for some products. We've seen folks in their 60s participating in the Digsite, so I don't think age is necessarily an issue. I think topics where privacy is really important. We've done some things on, loss of a family member. We've done things on emergency contraception, things like that, where, clearly the online environment, I think, is much more comfortable for participants. So I think those are definitely cases where these kind of Agile methods work extremely well.
Adding on to this question, someone asked, what about healthcare, i.e. physicians and allied health?
Yeah, we've seen this done with physicians. We've seen it done with nurses, hospital administrators, people with all sorts of different conditions as well. So definitely, I think it's a good application. I think the important aspect of all that is obviously having the right recruiting kind of tapped into that.
Great. Another question, can you do qual among multiculturals or micro segments such as Spanish-speaking Hispanics? Would that add extra timing to recruiting and analysis?
Yeah, so we have done work where we've allowed people to kind of opt in to speaking in different or to using different languages within Digsite, and that has worked well. Again, I think recruiting is key in that, so I think it can potentially add a little bit of time onto the recruit depending on who you're trying to find or where. We've also seen people do studies across the world, global studies, pretty effectively with this methodology as well. And so Digsite works in multiple languages. I know some of the other platforms do as well.
Great. What is the typical level of compensation that respondents receive for participation?
Sure. We kind of think about it here, probably a rule of thumb is around $10 for each kind of chunk of 15 minutes or so of their participation. It may be more or less depending on what you're trying to accomplish, but a total sprint might be they might get $25 for participating. If it's a physician, it's going to be way more. So it does definitely depend on the audience. If you're looking for high income folks, if you're looking for particular audiences, it's going to be more. But it's typically, probably half of what you might spend for in-person research because they don't have to travel. They don't have to deal with a lot of those logistics.
Great. Another question is, do you find that the participation ceiling by age is the upper 60s, or do you see people 70 and above also participating in online research?
That is a great question. One of the things that I find most fascinating about the older population is they are less active on social. In other words, it's only like 80% or 60% versus 80 or something. So they're definitely fewer percentage active, but realize for a lot of folks, this is the way that they can socialize when it might be difficult for them to get out of the house, difficult for them to travel and do other things. And so we do find quite a bit of usage. I just think that there are certain older audiences that are not as comfortable with technology. So you have to ask yourself the question, is my product a technology product and therefore this will fit well? Or is this a product that somehow would have, some kind of effect, knowing that you're not going to get everybody? And I'll just I always remind people for context that, when I started in market research, we were recruiting people in malls, and there's only 30% of people in this country who have access to a mall at that time. We're talking about right now, 60% of the population having access. So it's not really a huge set of bias, but I think if your product is specifically, a product for people who hate technology, probably not a good fit for this kind of environment, particularly with that older population.
Great. We got a specific video task question. What is the maximum length of a video clip that a participant can upload?
Sure, I think that depends on the technology that you're using. So at Digsite, we have an integration with VoxPopMe, and we can really scale those videos to, I think, any length. I don't think we have any kind of length requirements. Oftentimes, we recommend that you do these videos in kind of 2 to 3 minute chunks, and you kind of sequence someone through things, because it tends to help you, one, analyze the video much more easily, and for the participant, it kind of provides a set of variety. So maybe you don't want to ask everything via video. Maybe some things you ask via video questions, some things you ask kind of via a markup or a discussion question. It saves you some kind of video review time, although sometimes you do need people to go do a task or activity and take longer videos, and we have seen that be effective as well. You have to be careful, though. I think definitely there's certain types of uploading videos that you can hit the wall if you don't have specialized technology that you're using for that. So something to be aware of when you're talking to technology providers. And the other point I was going to make about video, that just for all of your guys' awareness, I mean, there's now basically, like, with our integration with VoxPop, we can automatically transcribe all of that video with kind of human transcription services in like 24 hours. And so what happens is you can literally read the content of that video response, highlight a sentence or two, and build a clip reel in a few minutes. It's just nothing like what we had to deal with back in the day when people recorded videos and you had to send it off for transcription. You had to create those Excel spreadsheets and all that stuff. I mean, there's just so much easier ways to do qualitative research today.
Great. Someone asked, have you tested advertising scripts or rough cuts?
Yes, and yes. That's a really common use case for Digsite. In fact, we had one company come to us and they basically said, hey, look, we've got to take our whole process down from taking 12 weeks to do the research to building the entire ad in 12 weeks. So how do we do that? And I think this is one way that really enabled folks. And then the other thing to think about for advertising that's really critical is the social effect. And so when you put maybe an ad or a video into Digsite before you kind of take it into the marketplace, one of the things you're able to see is if you get that oddball response, that kind of creates a snowball effect. So if there's something that you think that might be controversial or edgy in your ad, which I hope there is, because I think that's what gets attention these days, right? You want to make sure that you understand and are ready to respond to whatever controversial comments you get. That can be a really good thing. It can really help spark interest, but you need to be ready to deal with what those questions or thoughts might be, so that you're quickly able to respond.
Great. Another question is, how many participants are in a typical Agile community?
Yeah, we say the most common is probably 25 to 35. We do see cases where it's much smaller, particularly if you're trying to do really in-depth kind of usability kind of work. And then we see samples that are much larger, say in that 100 plus range. If you have a bunch of different segments of the population that you're trying to get a read on or compare among, you might need to have kind of a little bit larger group of each of those to kind of do that. So it can be kind of anywhere in there, but I'd say the most common is that 25 to 35.
Great. And it looks like we've answered all of your questions. So with that, Monica, thank you so much for being here. And thank you all for attending.